Dear colleagues, good afternoon. My name is Christian Herpfer. I'm the director of the TRUEDEM research project. TRUEDEM stands for Trust in European Democracies. It's a 3-year research effort implemented with the support of the Horizon Europe program of the European Commission. We have 12 teams from different European countries, and some of the team leaders are in presence. The objective of this ambitious project is twofold. First, we aim to design and implement a complex research effort to collect comprehensive evidence on the perceptions of trust and the judgment of trustworthiness in a range of European states. So we're studying trust and trustworthiness. Second, the project will develop a comprehensive and transparent toolbox of short-term and long-term policy interventions, including recommendations and methodologies for enhancing the trust in political institutions, boosting transparency and inclusiveness of representative political systems in Europe. Today's webinar is part of the TRUEDEM's new initiative. We are now planning and starting something which is called European Observatory on Political Trust Research. This observatory will be designed as a hub of political trust data, publications, announcements, and news. Among other activities, we plan a series of monthly webinars. In these webinars, TRUEDEM researchers and invited guests like today will share their research on political trust, and you are welcome to participate or comment and to debate the results. So this webinar today is the beginning of a monthly webinar on trust, organized by the TRUEDEM project and by the Observatory of Trust, which is coming out of this project. The observatory will be coordinated by Claudio Tufis, who is professor at the University of Bucharest and the leader of the team of Romania. We have here the team leader from Italy in presence, the team leader from Sweden, and the team leader from Ukraine. But I don't see Claudio yet. So I wanted to invite him to say a few words to us, but he is lost in transition. In today's first webinar, we are delighted to have with us Jochem van Noort. Jochem is a political sociologist, a political psychologist. He works as a research fellow at the Brussels Institute of Social and Population Studies at the Free University in Brussels. Jochem received 2 PhDs, one from the Free University in Brussels and one from the University of Groningen in 2021. And he had an interdisciplinary research project about education-based status, combining sociological, psychological, and political science methods. So he's working interdisciplinary and very successful in it. Jochem worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen on an international research project about polarization, belief systems, and identities, which is again an interdisciplinary project combining sociology, psychology, and political science. So some of us working just in one discipline, he works in 3 disciplines. He's very creative in combining these 3 disciplines. Currently, Jochem works on a project around generalized perception of social conflict thinking. This research interests revolve around inequality, group conflict, culture, and identity, primarily in the political domain. The topic of today's and the first webinar in this series is education-based affective attitudes. Higher education bias is related to more political trust and less populism. It is based on Jochem's article published recently in Acta Politica by Springer. And Jochem, I'm very delighted to have you as first speaker in our series. And the electronic floor is yours. Please go ahead.
All right. Hello. And thank you for inviting me. I'm I'll just share my screen. All right. Let's see. All right. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes, we do.
All right, perfect. All right, well, hello everyone. Indeed, my name is Jochem van Noort, and I'm indeed currently working as a political sociologist from a very interdisciplinary perspective on politics and education, and a lot of around educational conflict and how it affects politics. So I'll be presenting the paper on education-based affective attitudes. And Christian spoke about it a bit already, but indeed this is part of the Unpolar Consortium, Understanding Polarization. It's a consortium where we cooperate with, I think in total, about 9 different universities and a little bit more in a more informal way, which is part of the broader North Face governance project around democratic governance in a turbulent age. We focus on the role of identities and threat and belief systems to understand polarization and things like political trust, etc. And as part of this project, we had an international survey where we collected data on 9 different European countries with a pretty broad geographical and political diversity. And on the basis of this survey, I made a pre-registration of some hypotheses, and I wrote the paper that I'll be presenting today. So before I delve into the paper itself, I'd like to say a little bit about sort of the research line that this paper is a part of, to introduce the background. And with a couple of my colleagues that were also part of that North Face project, we have this research line that revolves around education-based identity, which is the idea that education has slowly but steadily become a basis for social identity and intergroup behavior. And basically, we say that or we sort of work from, on the one hand, neo-institutional theories on education, such as a classic paper by John W. Meyer on the effect of education as an institution from 1977, but also the work from David Baker on the school society. And basically, these institutional theories say that education as an institution has become so important and central in society that they have sort of independent effects. We often see education as serving the labor market, but the role of education has gone beyond its role for the labor market. It also affects culture and jobs and knowledge, etc. And we take that perspective on education as something that has become more and more important. And we combine that with social identity theory, or the social identity perspective, that focuses on how, when groups are becoming more, or certain group distinctions are becoming more important and salient in people's lives, they're more and more likely to become a basis for social identity and group behavior, intergroup attitudes, and potentially also group conflict. So if you combine these 2 perspectives, on the one hand, neo-institutional theory saying that education has become more and more important in everyday life, and the perspective of social identity theory that says that if group distinctions become more important, people are likely to identify with them. You get the probability that education can function as an identity. So people are likely to identify with people with a similar level of education. And this also sort of means that education and class, I won't be talking about that too much, but education is often seen as part of class. This sort of implies that education has become sort of more autonomous and independent and has an independent effect on, for instance, politics and other phenomena. From this general idea, we have this whole research line set up. We have a whole bunch of papers published around this, but I wanted to highlight a couple of these that are sort of related to what I'll be presenting here today. One is a paper on educationism, which is basically education-based prejudice. The idea that if education is related to identity and status, higher educated might be more likely to also have sort of negative feelings towards the less educated. And it's sort of about how people might have stereotypes, negative stereotypes about the less educated, perhaps positive stereotypes about the higher educated, which falls on this whole broad umbrella of education-based prejudice, which is also partially that I've used in this paper. Second paper revolves around voting behavior and how these kind of identity issues and status issues affect voting behavior towards higher educated or less educated politicians, and how that depends on the educational level of the voters themselves. So it's about things like perceptions of competence and in-group bias, etc. The third one is classified out of society, which also is about political trust. It basically tries to see to what extent misrecognition, which is basically a measure of low status, of experienced low status, works as a mediator for the difference in political trust between higher and less educated. We know that higher educated are much more likely to have high political trust, which is explained in a lot of different ways. We say, well, if education is related so strongly to status, then maybe this status element of education is also one of the reasons why less educated are less likely to trust the political system or be satisfied with democracy, etc. And lastly, I also wanted to highlight the paper that is currently under review that we're working on that uses data from the World Value Survey and the European Value Survey on political interest and education-based group formation, basically, across the whole wide world, like with the WVS data. It's under review, so I can't say too much about it. But these are a couple of papers that are sort of related to the paper I'll be presenting, and that might be of interest. So the paper itself is about education-based affective attitudes, which is very much related to this educationism concept. And basically, our observation starts with the fact that education is associated with a lot of different outcomes, both political and non-political. We see it in culture and health, etc., but also in a lot of different ways. It's very salient the last couple of decades that education is related to a lot of different political outcomes, like political trust and populism, voting behavior, attitudes, political beliefs, etc. So we have that observation. Now we also have the observation at educational level, like I just explained, that can work as a basis for social status and group identity. So people are sort of likely to identify with people with a similar educational level. And from this idea of social identity theory, which has always revolved around explaining group conflict, it might be that there is a sort of potential for education-based group conflict in society. We have a little bit of evidence for that. We have these research about stereotype content, about warmth and competence feelings towards various educational groups. We have this educationism paper that I just talked about, preferences for political candidates, that people prefer higher educated political candidates over less educated political candidates. There's something at stake there in the political arena that revolves around educational levels. And what this might lead to, this group conflict, is that people might develop these affective attitudes towards the higher and the less educated, positive or negative attitudes towards these groups. That might be very interesting, but then you of course ask the question, why and how would this actually be relevant for politics? And when we were thinking about that, the education is related to so many different political or so many different outcomes in politics. Where is this sort of most likely to be relevant, that these outcomes are affected by sort of the identity and status aspect of education? We know that education is also related to political beliefs, for instance. Higher educated are much more likely to be progressive, for instance, or more pro-EU, etc. But in our reasoning, education, when you look at it from this status and identity perspective, it's really the process of politics that is sort of most relevant for this conflict idea. And there's quite a bit of research recently into the relationship of education into this process of politics. There's the idea of diploma democracy that have said that higher educated are wildly overrepresented in political institutions, including political parties, and basically every form of political participation, the higher educated tend to be most present. And when it's forms of institutional politics, it's usually the higher educated that tend to take the more powerful positions. So that makes it very visible what this diploma democracy might mean, that our democracy is in a lot of ways kind of dominated by people with higher education diplomas. It is not just representation, it's also in who is represented. Recent research has shown that the preference of the higher educated are also overrepresented in policy making itself, which is related and maybe something that follows from the descriptive overrepresentation of the higher educated. But they basically show that the preference of the less educated are rarely translated into policy. And it only really happens if they agree with the higher educated. And these kind of inequalities, it's quite likely that citizens in societies are aware of these educational inequalities. We see it in political rhetoric, that people talk about the higher educated elite. People talk about the common people, which often refers to, as Trump has called it, the lowly educated, that he has said, I love the lowly educated. It's also something that features regularly in media reports, which might differ a lot across countries, but in the Netherlands and Belgium, there's often quite some attention to how education is nowadays so important in educational or in politics. Journalists have seen that less educated people are much more likely to vote for populist parties than higher educated voters. And what's also interesting here is that this overrepresentation of higher educated also has this very recognizable face to this inequality. There's also a lot of differences between higher and less educated in, for instance, cultural capital. So there are taste differences, there are differences in how people speak and how they behave, how they dress, etc. So this difference, this inequality might actually be very visible in media and in everyday life. So it's very likely that citizens themselves are aware of these educational inequalities. And when we combine these facts, we can sort of expect that these educational inequalities are not just observed by citizens, but they might also actually understand them from the perspective of identity. They might feel a certain, solidarity with, people that are of a similar educational level, but present in political institutions. And in that way, this process of politics, how institutions function and to what extent higher or less educated are present in that, becomes a stake in this educational conflict. And from this, you could thus reason that that sort of higher educated bias of having more positive attitudes towards the higher educated compared to the less educated, this sort of form of prejudice, is also associated with these process variables of politics, of which the most important ones are, of course, political trust and things like satisfaction with democracy, of how democracy is functioning. And nowadays also populism as sort of the main way in which dissatisfaction is currently voiced in our political systems. So we gathered data in our consortium. And right before that, I made a pre-registration of a number of hypotheses that sort of follow from this reasoning. A couple of ones are kind of sort of logical, that the education is positively related to higher educated bias, in the sense that the higher educated are more likely to have, a preference of higher educated over the less educated. But also that educational identification, that identity is also something that underlies this relationship. And then I have a number of hypotheses that this higher educated bias is something that predicts political trust, that predicts satisfaction of democracy, and also predicts basically lower populism. And we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but populism here, we measure it in multiple ways, not just with attitudes, but also with identification and voting intentions and sort of effective polarization towards parties. Right, so we have this Unpopular International Survey, and we combine here data on 9 different European countries, which you see listed here. And what we try to do is, we don't have that many countries per se, but we did try to get a very wide geographic distribution of these countries. So we have countries from Northern Europe, we have countries from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, and from Western Europe. And we also try to include Hungary and Poland because they're nowadays, when it comes to things like populism, very interesting countries, of course. The size of this data is that we have about 11,000 respondents, which is representative for the population of about 18 plus. The measures that we use is education, obviously. We also measure educational identification. We do that with a single question, quite simple, which is we just ask, like, to what extent do you identify with people with a similar level of education to my own? We do that for a whole range of different identities in the survey, also things like gender and country. But here we just focus on educational identification. And higher educated bias itself is measured as through thermometer ratings. So we've asked all respondents to indicate on a scale from 0 to 100 how positive they feel towards the higher educated and how positive they feel towards the less educated. And then when we take that difference, we can see to what extent they prefer higher educated over the less educated. Originally measured from 0 to 100, but we standardize this in the conventional way. We also measure political trust with parliaments, politicians, and the legal system. We measure satisfaction with democracy as the evaluation of the functioning of democracy rather than the abstract principle. And so populism, we measure it in 4 ways. One way is through populist attitudes, where we use the kind of common Ackermann scale that a lot of people use for these kind of things. So to what extent do people harbor sort of populist attitudes? We also look at voting behavior. So we classified all of the parties in these national political program or political systems as populist or non-populist and see whether people vote for populist parties. We also have asked respondents to what extent they identify with this label of the common people as a group. So this common people that populists often refer to what extent do people actually identify with that? And last, we've also had thermometer ratings of populist parties versus mainstream parties. We took the difference of that as a sort of political populist effect measure, to what extent they have more sympathy towards populist parties compared to mainstream parties. Our analysis consists of just regression with country dummies because we don't really have enough countries to do really multi-level or cross-level interactions. So in that sense, the analyses are relatively simple. We have also a number of sort of the standard control variables like education, income, age, gender, and ethnic minority status. Right. That's the data. So for the results, here you see a graph where we distinguish between the less, middle, and the higher educated. And on the y-axis, you see this higher educated bias. So the higher the score, the more higher educated bias people show. And we moderate these scores of the less, middle, and the higher educated by the extent to which they identify with people with a similar educational level. So what we see here are a couple of things. First of all, among the less educated, which is the solid line, we see that they're below 0, which means that although it's not significant, the respondents in our data do show a sort of in-group bias. The less educated, on average, tend to prefer less educated people over higher educated people. But as you can see, it's not super strong. At best, it's around 0.3 standard deviations below the mean. The second thing we see is that the higher educated, which is the dashed line, is well above this 0 point. So also the higher educated here show in-group bias. They also prefer their own group over the out group. But the third thing is obviously quite obvious, is that this line of the higher educated, it increases. So this preference of the higher educated for their own group is almost entirely dependent on the extent to which they actually identify with their own educational level and their own educational group. And this really sort of drives home the fact that this higher educated bias is this sort of identity process, right? but these are just averages, and there's still a lot of variances within these groups. So next up, we look at to what extent this higher educated bias is actually related to these outcomes. And the first that I want to look at is political trust and satisfaction with democracy. And these results kind of confirm our two hypotheses on these that say that higher educated bias significantly are related to political trust and satisfaction with democracy. So we see here that people that have a preference for higher educated over the less educated tend to have more political trust and are more satisfied with democracy. And we analyze this while controlling for education itself. So it's not just the difference between higher and less educated, that higher educated might be more positive. It's controlling for actual differences in education and also differences in income, that these affective attitudes are related to political trust. For satisfaction with democracy, it's even to such a case the extent that education itself is not significant anymore. There's still a correlation, but it's not significant anymore. On the next slide, we have higher educated bias and populism. Here we have the 4 different outcomes. You can see that higher educated bias is significantly related to all 4 indicators of populism. Also in meaningful ways, I think. With this, these negative relationships show that people that are more positive about the higher educated compared to the less educated are also significantly less populist. Right. So these are the results that are sort of average across all of these countries. So we also looked at, does this differ between countries? And honestly, not really. We see actually that these results are very, very similar across all of these countries. So with this pattern of that, the less educated have this sort of non-significant effect of identity, and the higher educated do have that, is present in all countries. We don't have a significant moderation in Denmark and Greece. But these results that I showed in the graph, they're basically present in almost all of the countries in very similar ways. And the effects of higher educated bias and political indicators are also very similar. There are a couple of countries where it works a little bit differently, and I think also in relatively interesting ways. And that's, first of all, in Spain, we don't really find effects of higher educated bias and political indicators. And it might be related to the fact that class, in a sort of classical way, revolving around income and material differences, is still very salient in Spain, with political parties like Podemos, etc., that mobilize much more on income than the sort of education-based cleavages that we see in Northern Europe. Also for Poland, it's slightly different. So for populism, we actually find similar effects, with higher educated bias being related to less populism. But for political trust and satisfaction with democracy, it's in the other direction. And it's probably related to the fact that during the field work, PIS party was still in power in Poland. So while higher educated bias might be related to populism, it's not really related to negative evaluations of the current political system, because a populist party is actually in power. Beyond that, we see that the strongest effects are present in France, the Netherlands, and UK, which are generally countries that are quite schooled and quite large amounts of a larger share of higher educated. And the weakest effects we find in Hungary, Poland, and then of course Spain, where we find null effect. Right. So how can we interpret this? I think there are a number of ways, or sort of number of main takeaways here that are interesting. First of all, it shows that identity or group-based affective feelings around education do actually play a role in citizens' attitudes and behavior towards politics. So education, although commonly seen as a sort of measure for skills and resources, there is also this identity perspective around education itself, separate from things like income or maybe also skills and resources, that affects people's political attitudes and political evaluations of the political system. Next takeaway is that we see that populism resonates more strongly with those who harbor less positive feelings towards the higher educated, or more positive towards the less educated. And this is also sort of a vindication of this idea that This idea of the common people has this sort of education dimension in it, that it tends to refer to people with usually lower educational levels. And it also shows that not only is that present in the rhetoric, it's also something that actually resonates with citizens themselves. They sort of resonate with this identity component in this populist rhetoric that sort of pits the less educated common people versus a higher educated elite. And yeah, that it resonates with them. Next up, what I also find interesting, and that's sort of one of the main reasons why I personally like this article so much, is that if this effective higher educated bias implies awareness, now it also applies sort of acceptance of dominance of the higher educated. We know that, as I just said, that the political system is very much dominated by the higher educated, and people might be aware of that, and they're also likely to evaluate that. And here you can see that, you know, this identity perspective or aspect to it is a part of how people evaluate the political system. So it also sort of vindicates this perspective of that there is a sort of lurking educational conflict in Western societies, where people on the basis of their education have a relationship to the political system that is tied into their observation of who is actually present in those political systems that are very much dominated by the higher educated. And that people might, you know, maybe not really, they might not really like how the political system is functioning now, that is tied into this overrepresentation of the higher educated. So political trust is also sort of an identity-based evaluation of those who are in power. Then there's sort of my last point, and that there's still discussion about in what direction does this relationship actually flow. This is, of course, cross-sectional data, so I cannot really say anything about causality per se. But if there are components of causality in there, we can talk about what is the direction of this. And on the one hand, you could expect that this higher educated bias means that people, for whatever reason, are sort of like their identity around education is activated, and they develop a sort of investment in this educational conflict. And then they look at politics and they see that, you know, politics is dominated by the higher educated, and they might not feel represented because of that. And that would then increase their dissatisfaction. And then kind of educational conflict would lead to dissatisfaction. It could also be the other way around, and that is that people have, for whatever reason, a certain level of dissatisfaction with the political system. They have a certain level of distrust. And then they look at politics and see that politics is dominated by the higher educated, and they start understanding their own dissatisfaction as revolving around education, and that they might see, I'm dissatisfied and I'm not higher educated, but the political system is there for the higher educated, and the higher educated have treated themselves very well in the past years, and that's the reason why I should be dissatisfied. And then they sort of start interpreting their own dissatisfaction in terms of education and education-based identity. So those are kind of the main takeaways and considerations that I think are interesting for this research. Got a slide with references, and that will be the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jochen. It was a very interesting presentation. I have a great pleasure to greet additional guests from our project team. Pippa Norris from Harvard, who is the co-PI of our project. Professor Kuzina, who is the national leader for the Ukrainian team. Professor Claudio Tufis, who is the national leader for the Romanian team. And Professor Koniodos, who is the leader for the Greek team. And Professor Simienska, who is the PI for the Weather Survey in Poland. So I would like to ask Professor Tufis, who is the coordinator of this new observatory on political trust, and he will design the whole observatory. Maybe Claudio, you want to say a few words about your new European Observatory of Political Trust?
Sure, certainly. First, thank you for the presentation and for agreeing to present your results, your research for our group. And I will come back probably with a question related exactly to your research. But to answer the question of Professor Herfer, first let me apologize for not having a camera on. I'm traveling and I'm not on a tool that has a camera, and the internet is pretty spotty. Now, about this European Observatory for Political Trust, uh, this is intended to become a general resource for people in the academia mainly, but also people in civil society, people in the mass media world. A sort of a general headquarter where people will come and find out the latest research, the latest studies, the latest data on trust, mainly in Europe. So when we start this observatory of political trust, we will have a number of different events similar to this one. We will ask people who have recently published or recently presented at conferences their research. We will also ask them if they would like to also submit a sort of a small video presentation to be archived on our observatory. In addition to this, we will create also sort of little vignettes, little stories that explain for let's call them lay persons who are not necessarily well read in the theory of political trust, the issues related to political trust. And this kind of research that you have presented that links political trust with various aspects of our societies, in this case high education, it's exactly the type of work that we would like to have for the observatory. An additional part of the observatory will be a sort of directory of people who are working in this area that are dealing with political trust. Again, with the idea that people who need, especially people from mass media or from the civil society, if they do need someone to help them with a particular project or to explain to them a particular issue related to political trust, this would probably be the best way for them to contact people. Of course, if they agree to be part of this directory of people that are working on political trust. And finally, we will also have a section on the website that is basically going to not necessarily scrape, but collect data from the most recent publications on political trust in the most important journals in the field, political science, sociology, and upload them in here as upload the abstracts, and then make sure that people can have all of the information in a single place, easier for them to just come here and look at, I don't know, whatever has been published in political science or sociology on the issue of trust in the last 2 or 3 weeks or the last month, and get access to the data from here via links that we will provide. So that's in a nutshell the type of work that we are trying to do in here. And of course, once the community will start to grow and interact, we can probably think of other ways in which the observatory can develop itself. But that's something that will probably happen in time. For the beginning, for the first stage of the observatory, we will have to basically disseminate information and create the infrastructure for people to come together and look for information related to political trust. So that would be a sort of description, very brief description of how we've thought about this observatory of political trust.
Thank you very much.
I don't know. Do you want me to talk more about?
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
I was asking if you want me to talk more about this, or if you want me to ask a question about the presentation.
I think
we
have now a Q&A session. You can ask your question, because I want to give the floor open for all participants.
Okay, so I'll start then with this question that kind of came to me as I was listening to the presentation. Based on our experiences in Romania. Of course, Romania is one of the countries that is less educated. It's actually at the bottom in the European Union countries when it comes to the percentage of adult population with a higher education degree. But even so, in the Romanian context, in the Romanian society, there's always been this sometimes heated debate related not only to the level of education, but also to the type of education that one gets, distinguishing between people who are educated, they get their college degree or more in hard sciences, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, versus people who are getting their degrees and their education in social sciences or in arts and humanities. And the argument has always been that there is a clear divide within the Romanian population of college-educated people between people who are coming from STEM, let's call them, versus people who are coming from the social sciences and from the arts and humanities. People from STEM being a little bit more mechanical in their interpretation of the way the society is working, and oversimplifying things. So for them, everything that is a problem has a very simple solution, and most often the solutions that are coming from them are the type of solutions that are not necessarily democratic in nature. So do you see any way of incorporating this type of variable into the research? So you've looked so far at the level of education, but maybe there would be space for an additional discussion, additional research that is looking also at the type of education that one does, and perhaps that is going to lead to interesting findings.
Thank you. I would like to have collect 3 questions. The next question is Professor Kuzina, the PI of the team from Ukraine in the TRUEDEM project. Irina?
Oh, first of all, thank you very much for very interesting presentation. Actually, I have kind of 2 small questions. First of them is, did I understand correctly that the scale for measurement of higher educated biases was from 0 to 100? If it was so, why this scale was chosen? Because I believe that it's too detailed, like for people to mark their attitude on this huge scale. It was my first question, and the second one was about, have you studied the correlation between the level of education and this variable measuring higher educated biases? If so, was there any correlation, and what was the direction? And probably the next point, it's not like a question, it's might be a suggestion for further studies. I guess it would be interesting not only to add like a type of education, humanitarian or technical to the study, but also like a proportion in every country of how many people have low education or high education, how it correlates with those biases.
Thank you. The first question is from Professor Pippa Norris, co-PI of the project from Harvard University. Pippa?
Hello, lovely to join you, and thank you for the presentation and paper. 2 questions, and they're difficult ones. First one, we know about the effects of education on trust and on many other aspects. What we don't know, I think, is still the causes of that. And there's the 2 theories, one of which is that it's the experience of higher education, which conservatives believe indoctrinates people, i.e. the faculty are very liberal, students are very liberal, there's a cancel culture in universities, which means that essentially others adopt liberal attitudes as a result of going to higher education. The second theory is that, in fact, it's self-selection. And so those who are more progressive and informed will choose to go into higher education. They come with certain values, and that basically will be reinforced but not changed as a result of higher education. And I know that Ian McAllister has done some work on that, trying to use panel surveys, but it's really difficult to get at. And the best of my knowledge, even though those work in educational studies have tried to look at this in educational sociology, we still haven't disentangled these effects. So what would you argue about the effects of either selecting into higher education with your pre-existing cultural attitudes, or the effect of attending and being experienced of this culture on your attitudes, which is actually driving what's going on, with big policy implications, of course. For example, Trump right now is suggesting that we abolish some of the endowment for universities and adopt new community colleges, which are going to give more vocational education. And the argument is it'll be more balanced in politics. Well, maybe not if people select to go. Second question, very briefly. Clearly, there's a distinction between class, which has been de-aligned, and education, which has been continued to be aligned. How do we actually unpack that? Because it's really, again, a classic question. And Jeff Evans has shown extensive research along with others that class has obviously changed and weakened, and yet education seemed to be the residual factor. But education is essential for SES, socioeconomic status. So again, how do we work out those differential patterns of alignment that are going on? I'd love to have your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Pippa. Joachim, your answer, please.
All right, those are a bunch of questions, all very interesting. So first off, there's the question about field of study and STEM versus humanities. I think it touches on a good point, and I think there are also a lot of different ways of thinking about this. I'm not sure how that would relate specifically to the situation in Romania, but one sort of classical way of looking at this is this sort of Bourdieusian difference between cultural capital and economic capital. We do know that people in the humanities are often in their social status in society much more dependent on their educational level for the cultural capital than that they are dependent on their economic capital. They usually end up in professions where they don't earn as much as people in other fields of study. I think that might be something that might relate to education-based identity, where those fields of study that rely more, where people would rely more on their educational level for their status, these things are also more salient than people from STEM, for instance. So I think that's maybe one way in which field of study or type of education might be related to these kind of processes of education-based identity. We haven't looked at it that much. We have looked at it a little bit, and it's not always easy to find actual patterns like this. But I think that's probably one way in which to look at. But I do think that also because, especially in the Netherlands or in Belgium, we have now like 40% higher educated or so. We have such a big group of higher educated people also likely to try to distinguish themselves from other higher educated. And then field of study can also start to play a role in there, in that. So that answers your questions a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Then a couple of questions about also methodology. The thermometer scale from 0 to 100. I think the two reasons why we stuck to the 0 to 100 scale is that on the one hand, it's sort of intuitive in the sense that it's a thermometer scale, so it measures temperature. So at least for people that use Celsius, 0 to 100 makes sense, as 0 is just really cold and 100 is just boiling hot. And the second reason is that this is also sort of the most common way in which it's used. I think it's a scale that's used a lot in the American National Election Surveys, and it's also a measure that's used a lot in the literature around affective polarization. They also use this scale from 0 to 100. Whether people have a trouble with that, I think it's a good point. I haven't looked at that. It might be that people find it too big. Yeah. I hope not. But I think there's a sort of intuitive sense to it in terms of temperature. So if people make that association, it can work well, I think. I think the second question, I'm not sure if I remember it correctly, but it was about the relationship between educational level and education bias or higher educated bias. Yeah, I think that's mostly what you see in the figure 1 that I showed, where the higher educated are just much more likely to favor the higher educated over the less educated. So there's a very clear pattern of in-group bias there. I think that was what the question was about.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. It was just the point my question was about. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. And you had a question about percentage of higher educated or less educated in societies. I think that's a very interesting point, because we actually have a couple of studies where we look at the influence of the share of higher educated on things like this. We have one paper in Social Forces about how kind of the percentage of higher educated affects to what extent people experience subjective social status depending on their educational level. So what the effect is of education on subjective social status as a function of the percentage of higher educated in countries. Also on misrecognition, we have a study like that. And the study that we use was value survey data for on political interest. Also uses percentage of higher educated. We made a more broader scale of how schooled the society is. So we look at a percentage of higher educated, but also the effect of education on stratification and sort of more educational ideological aspects that are all very strongly related to each other. And we use that in as a single scale to distinguish countries. And in general, what we find is that countries that are more schooled, these things do tend to be stronger. So for misrecognition, we find much stronger effects, much stronger differences between higher and less educated in countries that are very schooled. And countries that are not very schooled, these processes tend to be less present. And education works a little bit less as a sort of group demarcation. Right.
May I? I was asking that question. Pippa Norrison and myself, we did a paper a couple of years ago about non-European migrants in Sweden, where we found that the educated were the one that were not feeling as much as the lower educated ones, which were much, and talking about identity, this was really part of it. And it also went together with at home in a country like Sweden than the elderly, and also that men actually felt more at home than the women. All these three things were really surprising us because we would have believed it was the other way around. And we have found out later on that educational level is really a very crucial part when it comes to non-European migrants and how well they change or accommodate their identity to the majority population in a country like Sweden. I would guess you had the same results from Denmark, which you had included on that. I mean, differences for people being an ethnic minority. Do we talk about non-European minorities, or how have you defined being ethnic minority status?
Yeah, your connection fell away a little bit, so I might have missed it a bit. But
Sorry.
I think minority, we measured it just with basically just their subjective identification, to what extent they themselves identify as an ethnic minority group in their society. So no objective look at where are they born or where are their parents born, but just themselves as do they identify with an ethnic minority group?
Okay, yeah, thanks. And how many were they? Out of the 11,000, how many did identify themselves with an ethnic minority?
Gee, that's a very good question. I don't know from the top of my head. Maybe in the paper there's a table that shows it, but I'm not really sure.
We can check this later.
No,
Yeah, we can check that later.
It's 5 minutes before the end of the webinar. Are there any other questions, comments, statements?
Well, there are a couple of questions from Pippa Norris that I need to answer.
Sorry. Maybe we take Andrew Dawson, and then you can answer also Pippa Norris, if you don't mind. Andrew, can you please?
Sure. Yes. Thank you. And thank you very much for the presentation. I'll make it quick because I'm mindful of the time. So, I was really interested in this talk because there's a lot of work looking at the relationship between education and political trust, but not so much about educational identification. So I found that quite interesting. So I have to confess, I haven't yet had a chance to read the paper, but could you speak to the correlation between education and educational identification? And I don't know if you have a sense offhand, but are there more people who are, let's say, highly educated that would identify as less highly educated? Or are there more people who are let's say, less educated who identify as more educated? I'd be curious to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Please, Jochen.
Right. First of all, there are a couple of questions about, or a question about socialization versus selection, which is, you know, the classical debate about education effects, of course. I think it's something I would really, really like to dive into when it comes to educational identity and education-based status. Because I personally do tend to lean more towards the selection side of things. I think there are a couple of studies that have looked in these socialization effects. And in general, I think they often do find that people tend to already be quite progressive before they enter university. And people might change their opinions during university, but not per se in a predictive way or predictable way. I think from our perspective, you might maybe want to argue that no, there should not per se has to be a socialization effect, but there should be an effect of education itself. That people might not identify with being higher educated before they've entered university, and then through going through university, they develop this identity. I'm afraid that probably people before going to university already have a sense of sort of being higher educated or not before they've actually got the diploma. And the reason for that is, of course, that there is a really strong selection effect and a really strong family background effect, where people that are higher educated also tend to grow up in families that are higher educated. So I think in that sense, the development of identity and the sort of sense of social position or something is already maybe developed during upbringing. So I think also for these kind of facts, even though they revolve around education itself, you would still find quite strong, at least intergenerational effects, if not selection effects. And then the discussion around education and class, I think that's extremely interesting discussion and also very complex. But indeed, I think our argument is also that class is obviously very important, but education because the institution itself has become so much more important, it has become sort of independent from class. And we tend to see education as sort of under the umbrella of socioeconomic status together with income or profession. But when you look at the actual effects, they often tend to go into different directions. So in that sense, I think our literature or our research line would definitely sort of advocate for making this distinction between income and education and treating them as separate constructs. And also just, you know, seeing education for what it is itself, rather than just seeing it as something that's tied to class or socioeconomic status. Then the question about educational identification. It's a good point you touch on, because indeed there is a correlation between education and identification, because being less educated is quite a stigmatized and negative identity. So it's not an attractive identity for less educated to be attracted to. And we see that the higher educated are also much more likely to identify with their educational level than the less educated are. Because it's very difficult to turn less educated into something that's positive and something they can be proud of or so. So this correlation between education and education identification is very much positive. There's quite a strong, especially on the self-esteem dimensions of identification, there's quite a strong effect there. You also see that in the figure that I showed, that where you see this effective identification for the higher educated, but not for the less educated. That's partially maybe because of lower levels of identification, but also that identification itself is just a much more troubling concept for the less educated. It's much more difficult to kind of organize around or kind of figure out what that means for their political attitudes. So this identification, even if it exists, is much less potent than it is for the higher educated. And to what extent the higher educated and the less educated identify with sort of the wrong educational level? We just ask about whether they identify with people with a similar educational level. So with these data, I couldn't really answer that. I do think there are some papers by Rune Stubacher on education, where he uses a measure that is similar for higher educated and for less educated, and then less educated also have the opportunity to identify with being higher educated. I think in general, we see that people that are most on the outsides of the educational spectrum are most clearly defined as less and higher educated, so they're not really likely to misidentify in that sense. But you also have this group of middle educated that are quite interesting, that are not really per se less educated, because they maybe have a vocational education that they might be very proud of. But it's also maybe difficult for them to say, I'm really higher educated. They're also sort of more than less educated. And there, I think that something like that could play out in very interesting ways, how they deal with that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all participants for their, all scholars for their questions, contributions, and comments. And of course, thank you, Joachim, for your excellent presentation. The webinar is being recorded, so it will be available later on the TRUEDEM website. Maybe, Gina, you can say where it will be available.
Yes, it will be the TRUEDEM YouTube channel.
We have a YouTube channel. Okay, so unfortunately our hour is finished, and but we plan these webinars on a monthly interval. Thank you all for coming, and see you next month. Bye bye.